Welcome to Solutions with Courtney Anderson. I am your host, Courtney Anderson. Thank you so much for being with me today. As always, you can come to CourtneyAnderson.com, learn more about the show, and make a suggestion for a future episode, things of that nature. So today, we have a show that is part of our MYTH Warriors series. In our MYTH Warriors series, of course, we are donning our battle gear. We are warriors. We are ready, primed, and eager to take on different myths. And we are going to try to begin to determine whether or not these are not myths and are actually pretty credible, something that we should begin to investigate a little bit more, that might be something that we want to apply or to our practices or procedures, or that we might find to be potentially something that could be an asset. Or if this really is a myth, is it a lie, a falsehood, a fallacy, a trick? And if so, how important would it be for us to make sure that we don't fall prey to these untruth concepts that are out and about in our world? So our Myth Warrior series today, our specific topic is happiness is a choice. Happiness is a choice? Happiness is a choice! We're not really sure. Is it a question? Is it an exclamation point? Is it a period? Is it a statement? Is it a declaration? Let's explore. One of the things that's interesting about this topic is it's been suggested by community members, and people often bring this to my attention as something that they're wondering, is it accurate, not accurate, what does it mean? And it's also something that is out in pop culture. There's been a pop song that is happy. It's all about being happy, and it even has happiness as a choice in the lyrics, and it's just sort of out everywhere in pop culture. It was even a performance on the Oscars. It was in a film. I mean, it's sort of out and timely at the time I'm recording this, but whether or not that pop culture expression of this potential myth, happiness is a choice, is important, to me is not really relevant, because this is always something that you hear about, people toss around, happiness is a choice, and I think it's a perfect issue for us to explore. So is happiness a choice? And also, when we look at this type of potential myth, we have to ask ourselves, what is a choice? If something's a choice, does it mean that I absolutely 100% get to decide? It's up to me, only me? If I don't want it, I don't have to have it? Or does it mean that, maybe things are not really in my control, but there's a little bit of choice? I mean, is happiness a choice something that would be universal? Or is that only for somebody who's maybe a very internationally known wealthy pop star to sing songs about happiness as a choice? Yeah, maybe for them it is. They're famous and they're wealthy and they're talented, and so yeah, maybe for them happiness is a choice. Is it something that would apply to us? We're not internationally known famous pop stars? I don't know. Let's explore. So the first part of the show that, again, this concept that's to me interesting, or one of the more interesting parts of it, is the whole idea of choice and free will. And I've had several opportunities in different programs where I've talked about some of the sort of anger that I encounter when I'm out providing educational training or educational programs, or even keynote speeches, and I work with people, or I meet with people who share with me that they absolutely positively do not accept the premise that I'm this optimistic or this enthusiastic or this engaged, and I'm either and just an actor, just somebody who's just a hired prop, and I just say things that I don't really mean, and I'm doing that for some sort of monetary reason, or because some corporation or organization or governmental agency paid me to do it. And it's interesting. I would think that looking at the world and trying to make a determination of, do I have any choices or do I have any options? If so, what would they be? And what would be the outcome or the return on my investment of time and resources of looking at different options? So again, one of the fundamental principles of everything that I do in all these programs and training and the consulting and the teaching and even practicing law is I'm trying, just that's all I can do, to assist people with surpassing their goals. The challenge is, and part of the reason why I say I'm trying, is A, I don't control all the variables. B, I don't even control whether somebody is defining what their goals are honestly or accurately. I think sometimes people tell me that something's a goal and it really isn't. It's just what they think I want to hear, which is useless because it's not my goal, it's theirs. I define my own goals by myself. And so when we look at the idea of is happiness a choice, I think they're deeper philosophical, fundamental questions here. Is anything a choice? Some would argue that there's no free will at all in anything that we do. And then some argue that from different sort of philosophical viewpoints. Some people argue that from religious viewpoints and say, look, it's destiny. So if you believe in a predetermination or destiny or a fate to an exclusive degree or a large degree, then no, happiness is not a choice, not if it's totally predestined. That's one way of looking at the world. There's also on the other end of the spectrum some interesting research that I very basically think I understand somewhat, that maybe our perception of what our reality is itself is not even, quote, accurate, that there are alternate realities at several different times in different dimensions. Maybe that this whole situation that we're in right now that we think is reality is simply a computer simulation, and so it's again nothing's a choice, right? There's several different ways and viewpoints, I think, to come to the same conclusion that there is no free will. I've had so many really interesting discussions about this issue. One of the things that I think is fun in my personal life when I'm not working, my idea of a really fun party is one where you sort of sit around in a relaxed environment with great music and great conversation and you debate things like that. Is there any choice? Is there any free will? Like, to me, that's fun. Sort of like a highly engaging, thoughtful dinner party to me is a lot of fun. So I obviously, if I knew the answer to this question, whether or not this was a myth, I'd be an incredibly powerful person, in the scientific aspect, in a religious or spiritual aspect. But I certainly love asking it. Is it a myth? So first of all, are there any choices? I don't know the answer. And like I said, there's so many different ways for you to arrive at a conclusion that there are no choices. Everything is either part of a computer simulation or program. Everything is predestined. Everything's fate. I don't know. Assuming that there is no choice and there's no free will, then there is no happiness. They follow, right? You might think you're happy just because someone or something, whether it's a computer program or a deity, has set you up to perceive that. That doesn't mean you actually either feel it or that it has any meaning, because it's controlled by totally 100% other variables that you have nothing to do with. It's like if I go stand outside and it's windy, do I have any choice in whether or not it's windy? No. Now I have a choice where I stand, whether I stand in an area where there's no shelter or protection. But if it's windy and I don't have any control over it, then I can't sit there and argue whether or not it's a choice to be windy. It might be a choice to stand in the wind, assuming that you have the resources and the ability, but I don't have the ability to impact the weather to the best of my knowledge at this juncture. So, assuming it right out the gate, if your position, your philosophy, your perspective is that there's nothing in what you consider to be the reality that we are either sharing in this experience here or anywhere else in your perception of what's real, that it's all sort of controlled, then happiness is not a choice, but nothing is a choice. So that's one way to look at this. If you have that worldview, then this is absolutely, totally a myth, because you don't believe that there's any choice or any free will, that everything is just happens to us by some other entity. Again, people come at this from a scientific perspective. People come at it from a religious perspective. That to me is a whole other issue. But the end result is the same. I just don't believe there's any free choice. That everything, free will or choice, it's just all sort of we're just chess pieces in somebody or some other entity's control. So if that's true, then we don't have choice to be happy. And I would argue also that we're not actually happy. We're just feeling or doing whatever we're programmed to do, sort of like a little, marionette doll, right? Something pulls our strings, we dance, not because we want to dance, not because because that's all we can do. So that's one way. So if that's your perspective and that's your worldview, then absolutely, totally, positively, happiness is not a choice because nothing is a choice, and we have, I think, somewhat rather conclusively at least answered that question from that perspective. Now, the deeper issues is that perspective accurate or appropriate is a whole other truly fascinating issue. Yet, I think we can at least dispense of within this conversation, if that's your worldview, that there's no free will and there's no choice, then absolutely I don't believe happiness could be a choice because nothing would be. Happiness, misery, nothing. Pain, nothing. All right. Which brings us to looking and seeing at other different options, which would be that maybe there's some free will. Some people believe that that some things are predestined or many things are predestined, but some things you have control over. Again, from many different perspectives. Or there are other people way on the other end of the spectrum who believe that it's all free will. It's all choices. It's all up to us. So when you look at it from these two options, maybe there's some graduated amount of free will or choice, and maybe there's some total free will or choice. Again, with trying to delve into the different arguments for why, but let's just again look at these options in terms of our question: is happiness a choice, a myth? If I believe that there's any free will, so some, a little, a medium amount, a lot, or total, then somewhere in that spectrum, if I believe that choice exists, then it would seem that if choice exists, that potentially this concept of happiness might be within the options of something that I could exert this thing called choice within. Now, the idea of happiness is itself debatable. What does it mean? Does happiness mean that I'm dancing, I'm crying literally tears of joy, I have sort of jolts of energy running through my body at all times because I'm just ecstatic that I'm alive? I mean, what is happiness? Or is happiness that I kind of feel okay, no complaints? Is that happiness? I mean, I think that, again, is in the eye of the beholder. I think some of the research that I've understood coalesces around the idea that, looking from a perspective that there's at least some free will and some choice, that there's some genetic basis for sort of an emotional set point regarding happiness. So there's a fair amount of research from some potentially credible sources that asserts that there's some ability to discern how much of happiness or a positive outlook or a contentment or optimism or whatever you want to sort of label that sort of a positive outlook is part of our DNA. It's sort of we inherit that. And so the best of my understanding is a chunk of it, maybe 40%, somewhere between 40 and 60% is inherited. That we sort of have just like we have a certain height that we've inherited, potentially we've inherited a certain emotional makeup, and that part of our emotional makeup is going to predetermine whether or not we feel happy. And that's going to be, from what I've read, somewhere between 40 and 60% genetic. The other part of it, though, will be what happens to us in our life experience. So you might have a genetic set point biologically to be pretty happy and optimistic and positive. But unfortunately, you were born into a situation where you experienced war, violence, assault, degradation, starvation, and over time, these events have sort of negatively impacted your optimal sort of genetic options. We can see sort of like someone might have been genetically destined to be sort of a stocky, kind of large person, large frame person, but again, same situation. They're born into war, instability, poverty, famine, And because there was no food and it was a famine, then even though they were sort of set up to be a large, stocky person, they're emaciated. And that's because the environment, they couldn't get access to food. And they certainly couldn't get access to food in large enough amounts to sort of meet what their body frame would have ideally done. So I think there's an understanding of at least sort of broadly the outlines of that argument. I think the interesting question is, okay, if there's some genetic component, which again is totally debatable. Some scientists, again, say there is, some say there isn't. We have to look and say, who's the scientist, what sort of methodology did they use, what sample size did they use. You have to look and try to figure out how they tell you this. Where are they getting this from? The other thing is, if we accept that, okay, maybe there's some sort of inherited emotional or personality set point for something like happiness, and if there's also another environmental factor that will sort of impact where within your preset makeup you arrive based on your access to sort of all the things we just talked about, right? Food, nutrition, safety. It's difficult to be happy if you're in the middle of just completely intense, nonstop, violence. Then even if you're really predestined to be happy, it's very difficult. There are so many, again, back to pop culture, it just never changes. As I was sharing it, there's, some songs and pop media. Happiness is a choice. True. Okay, maybe that's existing. But there's a lot of other pop narratives, media experiences, movies, television shows, fiction, and some nonfiction that explore, someone under these very difficult circumstances, like I just alluded to, right? The worst of the worst that happens to them beyond their control. Someone's in a concentration camp. Somebody's in the middle of a horrible civil war. And yet, there they are, able to find a little bit of joy in that just unbelievably horrific or gruesome situation. Certainly most of us in the world have heard and I hope read Diary of Anne Frank, and there's an example of someone under very intense environmental pressure for negativity, and yet still was able to journal and express a wider range of teenage and our universal human experiences and emotions. So we have, throughout all of our different time periods, different examples of, I think, sort of this archetype that, okay, if there is some free will, then even under the most difficult, challenging, awful circumstances, here's some examples, again, whether fiction or nonfiction, that we can sort of aspire to, of somebody who, if there's a choice, then they made a choice for happiness. However limited it was, even if they were sort of hidden away in a very limited physical space, or they were subject to awful abuse, or whatever the situation is. And part of, some people would think that's laudable. Some people would argue, well, see, that proves the whole point. Happiness is a choice. And I can give you all these examples, and I can show you consistently throughout recorded human history narratives and examples, again, of people who chose under duress, under the worst of the worst, to express some semblance of happiness, and that maybe that is in and of itself something that we should applaud and aspire to. And other people who would say, well, that's just silly. Maybe those are just little anecdotes, I don't know, to make people feel better or to make people feel bad. Maybe those are things to make us feel bad, so that, the whole argument, I can't ever, complain about anything, because you could always turn around and say, well, look at this other, person who was, in this horrible situation. They were a prisoner of war, or these horrible things were happening to them, and they were positive. How dare you complain? Is that supposed to shame us? Is that supposed to make us feel guilty and shameful, so that we never have the ability to express any, suggestions or anything that might possibly not be happiness? Some would argue it's propaganda. Let's say that there's some element of free will. Let's just put that on the table, because we already have tried to deal with the first issue. There's none. We're looking now, is there a percentage of it? If so, maybe it's gradation, or is there a situation where there's total free will? But even if there's some individual free will, what if you live in a society where the whole entire purpose of the society is to take away free will, is to try to focus on obedience and compliance? is to try to ensure that people don't ask questions and don't deviate. You see it in a lot of authoritarian, totalitarian societies, right? There's happy music. There's a lot of public adoration and expression of what is supposed to be happiness at their dictator or the state or whatever, is the entity that they're supposed to be expressing all this glee. And some would argue it's manufactured. Some would argue, well, maybe that's just how they feel. And because they usually are cut off from dissenters in these types of societies, then is it just peer pressure? I don't know. But I do love looking at the dynamic of how other people's fear or perception of what people will think of them impacts how they behave. Not even in these sort of extreme examples of an entire society where they're literally your life is is at risk if you dissent or say you're not happy. But even in allegedly or purportedly free societies, we have challenges where people feel like, oh, I really didn't feel good about that, but I just went along with what everybody else said. And you see it in examples, with people who you would think when you read the facts, you would think, well, how could they not know better, right? Like a college group, the sorority or fraternity hazing or something. You think, well, what's that? Like they're already, in a good fortune situation. They're in school, the university, and yet they engage in these horrible abusive things, and people will go and they'll say, well, I just was going along with what everybody else did. So is it really a choice? Are we that easily, manipulated and controlled by other people? So if somebody wants us to feel happy, then we'll just feel happy whether or not we really do? And is that a different question from the original issue of whether or not there's any free will? So there's a lot of things that we have to ponder. I would argue this. I would be thrilled to in my lifetime be able to get more information to better understand all these potential options. Whether or not there's any free will, whether or not this is a computer simulation, whether or not a specific religious tradition or deity is actually responsible for everything, and if so, of course, which one? That's hugely debatable in all the different religious traditions. And while I wait with anticipation for the answer to these questions, I'm going to make the best decision that I can with the information I have on hand, which is, of course, one of the things that we advocate in all of our programs, and especially our management, leadership, entrepreneurial business programs. You're never going to have perfect information. You're just going to do the best you can with what you have. And we're going to look at your potential outcomes. You're going to try to do an assessment to the best of your ability to decide what would be, based on your own ethics, the best outcome. So I don't have answers to all of these questions, but I'm going to assume this. If I do have any ability to express choice or free will, I am going to argue that it is potentially an advantage to either choose happiness or to at least perceive that I'm choosing happiness, if that makes. In other words, if I don't have actual free will, but I just think I do, even if I don't actually have it, but I think I do, if I'm thinking I'm choosing happiness, I'm still arguing that's an advantage. Why? Well, let's look. If happiness is sort of a very positive feeling, then the opposite would be, in a generic sense, a very negative feeling. So if I could choose, in whatever situation that choice presents itself, happiness or the opposite, misery, let's just say happiness or misery. What's the benefit to choosing misery? Well, let's see. There's a lot of science that expresses or purports to express that there's the mind-body connection, so that if if my mind is racked in misery, that there's physical and physiological negative ramifications to my health due to that. I can see where there's an advantage to what I believe to be truth. So I can see where if someone felt like, I'm going to speak truth to power, or I'm in one of these societies or one of these groups, or I'm in one of these things where it's a hazing situation, and I'm standing here thinking, this is not who I am, I'm not doing this, then I can say, I'm not doing this, and I can leave, or, call law enforcement, or, leave and then call law enforcement or whatever. So I can see an advantage in being assertive and not wanting not making a decision for the group. But those are, to me, the same option. It's always me thinking I have free will or thinking I'm expressing an example of free will. If the options between happiness and misery, I don't really see many of the benefits of the misery. Again, there's the alleged science that shows the contagion of laughter, even among babies and pre-verbal people. There's the idea that misery loves company, which is a bit of a cliche, but you tend to see that. People who are very miserable they like expressing the misery, and then they usually like to have other people express it, because otherwise, when a miserable person is expressing their misery around a happy person, then neither group is pleased, but the miserable person tends to be angrier at the happy person than the happy person is at the miserable person, right? Because the happiness by definition sort of is a positive. So I'm feeling happy and I'm having whatever a nice day, and there's someone else and they're feeling misery, and we're going with at this point that there's some choice and or a perception of choice, and if I have that choice, I'm not really seeing the benefits of misery. Based on that, I'm going to conclude, for the basis of our program at this juncture, that excluding the first option we talked about, where there's no choice and no free will for whatever reason, which would foreclose then any choice, whether happiness or misery, excluding that option, if there is any choice, and I have two polar opposites, happiness and misery, I'm gonna say we're going to go with happiness, because there are benefits to it, even if they're delusions, right? Even if here I am deluding myself that I'm happy, but I'm really in this horrible situation, and I'm going to have a bad outcome no matter what. I'm in a famine. I'm in a civil war. I'm trapped in a natural disaster, and I'm going to run out of oxygen soon. Even in those situations, even when the conclusion is going to be the same negative conclusion, right? I'm going to run out of oxygen. I'm going to die of famine. In that little bit of time, assuming that we do have or perceive to have this little option, why not go with happiness? The same outcome's coming anyway, right? I have a certain amount of time left. So I can either spend it on this misery option or something close to it. Oh, this is horrible. I hate this. I'm angry. If there's somebody else there I can communicate with, maybe, expressing my anger to them, or I hate you, and maybe I can lash out in violence. I don't know. Or option two, I have the same amount of time. Option two, maybe I'll just sit here and I'll do my version of whatever happiness is. I'll think good thoughts. I'll have, in my mind, I'll do a visualization of a happy time in my life or a good place. I'll not be agitated with my heart racing and anger and rage and screaming and trying to express that, but instead, because I'm doing my happiness, my breathing is relaxed. My other, physical systems are not negatively impacted, by rage and anger. Yeah, you're going to come to that same outcome. People would say, yeah, but there you are, trapped in the natural disaster. Well, yeah, the happiness isn't going to change the outcome, but it can potentially make the duration of whatever time I have better. And is there some benefit to that? Many would argue, no. Many people would say, well, that's just rose-colored glasses, and you're just hiding from the reality. But my point is, you're not hiding from it. You understand the situation. And I'm not, again, trying to use, but again, example, something like Anne Frank or that type of thing. It's not like Anne Frank didn't understand the situation. She did. She got it. And you also read about people all the time who, have survived. You have these more recent examples where somebody's, been trapped in, a basement or some hidden structure in somebody's house. They were either kidnapped or sometimes it's a relative. And they were trapped there for years, sometimes decades. It's not that they don't get that this is a bad situation. They get it. But if you have a choice between the perception of the reality in your mind of misery or happiness, why not grab a little bit of happiness while you can? Why not get it while you can? In the words of Janis Joplin. I mean, in some respects, you could argue that this argument is what we all face. that the end of our body as we know it, and our time as we know it, and the world as we know it, to the best of our understanding, will come. It will cease. And that we just all here on some clock. We don't know exactly how much, but we're going to the best of our understanding as we are now, our perception, we're not going to be here as we are now indefinitely. So why not, if we have whatever time that there is, if I can choose misery or I can choose happiness, why not choose a little bit of happiness? It makes my physical body feel better. It makes my mind feel better. And if I sit there and I can, in my head, visualize or go to a positive place, why not? So to the best of our understanding within sort of the cosmos of things that we tried to touch on in this episode, my conclusion and my argument would be that if we believe we have the ability to choose, why not choose happiness? There are some tangible positive benefits of the happiness situation, and there are less tangible positive benefits of the misery choice. So why not just go with the better odds? And if that's accurate, then within that understanding of that framework of understanding the universe or our existence as we know it, then happiness is a choice. Yeah, we will. When we believe we have an option, why not choose it? And there's so much in the motivational world and improvement, personal improvement world. It's all about, you choose your attitude, it's how you react. And some of that does just sound like, that's not news. But in my own life, sometimes I'll experience it. I'll be upset about something. I don't know, whatever. Maybe I cut my hand or something, and I'm thinking about my pain in my hand. And then all of a sudden I'll change my thought, and I'll start to think about something that makes me feel better. Maybe it's a great song I like, or I eat a wonderful vegetable that I love, and I'm like, that tasted good. And it took my mind off that stupid cut. Why not? And the more you make those decisions, the more you want to be around other people who are trying to mitigate the misery. Why not? If we can, assuming that this is our perception at least, that we can, why not? So I thank you so much. I strongly encourage you that if you believe that you have choices, I would argue you should at least choose the best outcome for you. Choose the positive. So as we conclude, I again encourage you, please come to CourtneyAnderson.com. And I thank you again so much for joining me in this discussion, which was somewhat almost like a virtual dinner party, where we got to delve into some of the things that are just fascinating ideas. Thank you so much.